Behind the wire, time no longer behaved as it once had. It did not move forward with purpose or urgency, nor did it retreat into memory. It simply accumulated, heavy and unshaped, pressing down on each hour until days lost their edges. The man stood within this suspension having already accepted what he believed would come next. Punishment was not merely anticipated, it was assumed, internalized long before capture ever occurred. War had taught him that defeat carried a moral price, that surrender was not an end but a prelude to reckoning. He did not question whether punishment would arrive, only when and in what form. The wire itself was more than a physical barrier. It was a visible conclusion, a line that separated what had been from what must now follow. On one side lay action, allegiance, movement, and belief. On the other lay consequence. He understood this boundary instinctively, as though it had always existed, waiting for him. Each strand of metal reinforced the idea that he was now an object to be processed, categorized, and disciplined. The wire promised order, and within that order, suffering felt not just likely but appropriate. Silence dominated the camp, but not the quiet of peace. It was the silence of containment, shaped by routine and regulation. Footsteps followed predictable paths. Whistles signaled transitions. The environment seemed designed to erase individuality without overt violence, to reduce existence to compliance. This was not unexpected. In his mind, captivity was meant to strip a man down to the bare acknowledgement of defeat. He prepared himself accordingly, withdrawing inward, conserving emotion, bracing for humiliation as one braces for weather. He replayed assumptions learned over years of conflict. That captors punished because they must. That mercy was weakness. That systems of war, once activated, did not allow for deviation. History, as he understood it, did not leave room for nuance in moments like this. There were victors and there were vanquished, and the relationship between them followed a known pattern. He believed himself to be standing at the beginning of that pattern's final phase. The camp's physical reality reinforced this belief. The wire cut the landscape into narrow fragments, offering glimpses of sky that felt deliberately rationed. Watchtowers loomed not as threats but as reminders of constant observation. Barracks were functional, stripped of comfort, arranged with mathematical efficiency. Everything suggested permanence, as though this place had not been created for temporary containment but for prolonged waiting. Waiting, he thought, for justice to be delivered. Justice, however, was not a concept he associated with fairness. It was closer to balance, an impersonal force that corrected imbalance through suffering. He believed the war had created a moral debt, and now he was here to pay it. In that belief, there was a strange comfort. Expectation reduced uncertainty. If punishment was inevitable, then fear could be managed. He did not hope. Hope would only introduce variables. The men around him carried similar expressions. Faces marked not just by exhaustion, but by acceptance. Conversations were sparse and cautious, framed by the same underlying assumption. Whatever this place was, it was not designed for mercy. The absence of immediate brutality did not reassure them. It merely delayed what they believed was coming. Delay, in this context, felt like strategy. He observed the guards closely, searching for signs that would confirm his expectations. He looked for contempt in their expressions, for pleasure in authority, for evidence that cruelty was simply awaiting permission. Every gesture was scrutinized. Every command was weighed for hidden intent. He interpreted neutrality as restraint, not benevolence. Restraint, he believed, could be withdrawn at any moment. The routines of the camp settled into him quickly. Repetition dulled the edges of thought, but it did not erase the underlying narrative he carried. Each routine felt like preparation, a slow tightening of a system that would eventually demand something from him. He imagined interrogations, tribunals, retribution administered not by individuals but by institutions. He imagined being reduced to a case file, a record, a cautionary example. In moments of solitude, he examined his own readiness. He rehearsed emotional detachment. He reminded himself that suffering, when expected, could be endured. He resolved not to plead, not to ask for understanding. To do so would imply surprise, And surprise was a luxury he did not believe himself entitled to. He had crossed into this space knowing, or believing he knew, how such stories ended. What unsettled him, though he did not yet recognize it as such, was the lack of escalation. Days passed without incident. No dramatic assertion of dominance arrived. No symbolic act to mark his moral position. The camp remained consistent, almost indifferent. This indifference was difficult to interpret. It did not align with the narrative he had constructed, but he resisted altering that narrative. To do so would require acknowledging uncertainty. He told himself that systems moved slowly, that punishment required paperwork, deliberation, approval. That patience was not mercy but bureaucracy. This explanation allowed him to maintain his expectations intact. It preserved the logic of inevitability. Still, the waiting grew heavier. The absence of cruelty began to feel like an unanswered question. At night, when the camp quieted and the wire seemed to hum faintly in the darkness, he considered the possibility that he had misunderstood something fundamental. Not about the war, but about its aftermath. The thought was unsettling, and he pushed it away. To question the framework now would be to stand without armor. Better to believe in punishment than to risk confusion. He did not yet see the wire as permeable in any sense. It remained a symbol of finality. What lay beyond it in his mind was not freedom but judgment deferred. He believed the camp existed to hold him in place until the proper moral machinery engaged. That belief shaped every moment, every breath. It kept him anchored to an identity defined by consequence. In this suspended beginning, nothing dramatic occurred. No violence erupted. No speeches were made. And yet, something subtle had already begun, the slow erosion of certainty. The camp, through its very normalcy, planted the first fracture in his expectations. He did not name it. He did not acknowledge it. But it was there, quietly undermining the story he had arrived with. For now, he remained behind the wire, waiting not just for punishment, but for confirmation that the world still operated as he believed it did. He stood within a system he thought he understood, unaware that its greatest impact would come not from what it did to him, but from what it refused to do. The first disturbance did not arrive as an event, but as an absence. It came quietly, through the continued failure of something expected to materialize. Days passed, then more days, and still there was no escalation, no visible transition from containment to punishment. The man remained alert, interpreting the delay as calculation rather than restraint. Yet with each uneventful morning, the logic he relied upon grew thinner. In war, patterns asserted themselves quickly. Here, the patterns seemed deliberately unremarkable. The guards moved through the camp with an efficiency that did not rely on intimidation. Their voices were level, their expressions largely unreadable, not hardened by contempt nor softened by sympathy. Orders were issued plainly, without embellishment. There were no displays meant to remind the prisoners of their inferiority, no rituals of degradation. This neutrality unsettled him more than open hostility would have. Hostility was predictable. Neutrality forced interpretation. He paid close attention to small details, searching for meaning in gestures that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. A ration distributed without delay. A correction made without shouting. A moment when a guard paused, not to threaten, but to clarify an instruction. These acts were not generous, but neither were they punitive. They existed in a narrow space between obligation and choice, and it was that space that troubled him. Food, though limited, arrived consistently. It was not used as leverage, not withheld to enforce compliance beyond what routine already required. Medical care, when necessary, was provided without commentary. The sick were not made examples of. The wounded were not interrogated through neglect. These realities contradicted the image of captivity he carried within him, and yet he resisted naming them as kindness. To do so would require admitting that his expectations were built on something incomplete. The camp itself began to feel less like a holding pen for retribution and more like a place structured around order. That distinction mattered. Order did not inherently require cruelty. It required predictability, and predictability was something the camp provided in abundance. Every day followed the same rhythm, the same sequence of movements and pauses. This rhythm dulled anxiety but sharpened awareness. In the absence of chaos, the mind had space to question. He watched the guards not as individuals, but as representatives of a system. He expected inconsistency, lapses where personal prejudice might surface. Yet what he observed instead was restraint applied evenly. The system did not bend to individual moods. It did not escalate in response to minor infractions. When rules were enforced, they were enforced proportionally. This consistency suggested intention rather than accident. Still, he told himself that restraint was temporary. That kindness, if it could be called that, was strategic. Perhaps it was designed to soften resistance before interrogation. Perhaps it was meant to cultivate compliance through confusion. War had taught him that appearances were often deceptive. He reminded himself that mercy could be a tactic. But even tactics usually carried an edge, a pressure point. Here, there was none. The guards did not attempt to extract information beyond what was administratively required. Conversations, when they occurred, were brief and functional. No one probed his past or demanded explanations. The absence of moral interrogation felt almost disorienting. He had prepared himself to defend, to justify, to endure accusation. Instead, he was left alone with his own thoughts. This solitude became increasingly difficult to manage. Without an external enemy pressing against him, his internal assumptions had nowhere to anchor. He began to notice how much of his identity had been shaped by opposition. By being treated not as a villain or a symbol, but as a person to be managed, he felt an unexpected erosion of certainty. There were moments when he caught himself waiting for the other shoe to drop, bracing for a cruelty that never arrived. Each time it did not, the tension did not dissipate, it accumulated. Expectation unfulfilled became its own burden. He began to wonder whether punishment, when it finally came, would be worse for having been delayed. The kindness, if that was what it was, felt almost cruel in its ambiguity. He listened to conversations around him more carefully. Others noticed it too, though few spoke of it openly. There was a shared reluctance to trust the atmosphere. To acknowledge the absence of brutality felt like tempting fate. Better to remain guarded, to assume the system would reveal its true nature in time. Yet the longer the restraint persisted, the harder it became to dismiss. The guards' behavior did not fluctuate with mood or circumstance. Even when tensions rose within the camp, their response remained controlled. They intervened when necessary, but without excess. Authority was asserted through presence rather than force. This form of control was unfamiliar to him. He had been taught that power announced itself loudly. Here, it spoke softly, and that softness carried weight. He began to reflect, reluctantly, on the contrast between expectation and reality. The contrast was not dramatic, but persistent. It pressed against his assumptions like water against stone, slowly reshaping them. He did not yet interpret this as a moral challenge. It was, at first, a practical one. If punishment was not immediate, then perhaps it was not the primary objective of this place. This thought unsettled him deeply. It suggested that captivity did not automatically equate to condemnation, that surrender did not always lead to degradation. Such ideas threatened the framework through which he had understood both his enemies and himself. If they did not hate him as he expected, then what did that say about the narratives he had accepted without question? He noticed, too, the absence of spectacle. No attempt was made to dramatize victory. The guards did not perform dominance. There were no visible symbols of triumph beyond the simple fact of containment. This lack of performance stripped the situation of its expected emotional cues. Without them, he struggled to locate himself within the story he believed he was living. The wire remained unchanged, but its meaning began to blur. It still marked separation, still enforced limits, but it no longer felt like a prelude to suffering. It became something more ambiguous, a boundary maintained without malice. That distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. He began to understand that what unsettled him was not kindness itself, but its consistency. A single act could be dismissed as anomaly. A pattern could not. The pattern suggested principle, and principle, when encountered in an unexpected place, forced reconsideration. By the end of this period, though no official milestone marked it, he felt a subtle shift within himself. Not relief, not trust, but disorientation. The world had failed to behave as predicted. The moral landscape he had prepared to navigate no longer aligned with the terrain beneath his feet. He remained cautious, guarded, and uncertain. But beneath that caution, a quiet question had taken root, one he could no longer entirely suppress. If punishment was not the point, then what was? The camp offered no answer. It did not explain itself. It simply continued, day after day, in restrained defiance of his expectations. And in that defiance, something began to change, not in the rules, not in the wire, but in the space where certainty had once lived. The moment when expectation finally broke did not arrive with force or clarity. There was no single incident he could later point to and say that everything changed there. Instead, it unfolded gradually, through a series of interactions so ordinary they seemed almost invisible at first. A question asked without suspicion. Assistance offered without condition. Time given without demand. Each moment on its own appeared insignificant, but together they formed a quiet pressure that began to undermine the internal architecture he had relied upon since his capture. One afternoon, during a routine task, a guard corrected his work not with irritation but with calm explanation. There was no rebuke, no insinuation of incompetence or defiance. The correction was practical, almost collaborative. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it lingered with him long after it ended. He replayed it repeatedly, searching for hidden meaning, for manipulation. None emerged. What disturbed him was not what happened, but how little effort had been made to assert dominance. Another day, he was called aside not for interrogation but for clarification. A form required completion. The process was slow, methodical, devoid of accusation. No one asked him to justify himself. No one framed the interaction as moral accounting. He had prepared himself for questioning, for being reduced to a representative of his uniform, his side, his past actions. Instead, he was treated as an individual navigating procedure. This reduction of drama felt almost destabilizing. Medical attention became another point of friction between expectation and reality. When illness spread through the camp, response was swift and measured. Quarantine was enforced where necessary, but care accompanied control. He watched as guards facilitated treatment without commentary, without visible judgment. The sick were not shamed. The vulnerable were not exploited. This care carried no overt message, yet it communicated something profoundly unsettling, that his well-being mattered within limits that did not require his redemption. These interactions forced him into an uncomfortable position. If cruelty was not forthcoming, then his internal posture of endurance had nowhere to land. He had oriented himself around resistance to harm, around bracing for degradation. Without that external pressure, his defenses began to turn inward. He found himself questioning not what the captors intended, but why he had been so certain of their intentions in the first place. The wire still surrounded him, still enforced separation, but it no longer felt like a threat waiting to be activated. It became something else entirely, a boundary maintained through discipline rather than hatred. This distinction, subtle as it was, carried enormous weight. Discipline implied choice. Hatred implied inevitability. The realization that choice was present unsettled him more than any act of violence could have. He began to notice the tone of conversations among the guards when they thought no one was listening. There was no celebration of victory, no talk of vengeance. Their discussions centered on logistics, schedules, weather. The war, when mentioned, appeared distant, almost abstract. This absence of obsession with triumph or retribution contradicted everything he had been taught to expect. It suggested a separation between duty and emotion that he had rarely encountered before. With this realization came an unexpected discomfort, the erosion of his moral insulation. He had relied on the belief that he was hated, that his captors saw him only as an enemy. That belief allowed him to compartmentalize, to frame his suffering as part of a larger, impersonal process. Without it, he was left exposed to a more personal form of reckoning. Being treated with restraint forced him to confront his own capacity for judgment, for assumption, for simplification. He found himself recalling moments from before his capture, moments he had previously dismissed or justified. Actions taken under orders. Decisions made without reflection. He had once believed that moral complexity was a luxury afforded only to those far from the front. Now, faced with a system that exercised restraint without spectacle, that belief began to fracture. If restraint was possible here, after so much destruction, then perhaps it had always been possible elsewhere as well. This realization did not arrive as guilt, at least not immediately. It arrived as confusion. The narrative he had constructed about the world no longer aligned with his lived experience. The war had taught him to expect clear moral boundaries, sharply drawn lines between right and wrong, ally and enemy. The camp, in its quiet refusal to perform those distinctions, introduced ambiguity. Ambiguity, he discovered, was far more difficult to endure than hostility. He tried to explain it away. Perhaps this was an anomaly. Perhaps individual guards were exceptions within a harsher system. Yet time passed, and the pattern held. There were no hidden escalations, no sudden reversals. The consistency of restraint suggested something systemic rather than accidental. It was not kindness as sentiment, but kindness as policy, and that realization carried its own weight. At night, lying awake in the dimness of the barracks, he found his thoughts circling the same question. What was being asked of him, if not submission through fear? The absence of explicit demands left him unmoored. There was no script to follow, no expected performance of remorse or defiance. He was free, within confinement, to think. That freedom felt dangerous. The internal crossing began there, in thought rather than action. He crossed from certainty into uncertainty, from expectation into reconsideration. The wire, once a symbol of final judgment, became something else entirely. It marked not just physical separation, but a threshold between old assumptions and new possibilities. Crossing it mentally felt like a betrayal of everything he had believed necessary for survival. He did not share these thoughts openly. Among the other prisoners, caution still prevailed. To acknowledge the restraint of the captors felt like tempting disappointment. Yet in private moments, he sensed a shift occurring not just within himself, but within the camp as a whole. The atmosphere remained tense, but the tension was no longer fueled solely by fear. It was fueled by uncertainty, by the unsettling possibility that the story they expected to live through might not unfold as planned. This uncertainty forced a reckoning he had long postponed. If he was not being punished, then what did that say about his understanding of justice? If mercy could exist without proclamation, then perhaps it was not the absence of accountability, but a different form of it. This thought lingered, uncomfortable and unresolved. The crossing was incomplete, hesitant, fraught with resistance. He did not yet trust what he was experiencing. He remained vigilant, aware that circumstances could change. But something irreversible had occurred. The moral geometry of his world had shifted. Lines once thought rigid now appeared flexible. Boundaries once assumed absolute revealed themselves as choices. In this space between expectation and reality, between fear and reflection, he stood suspended. The wire still surrounded him, but its power had altered. It no longer defined his fate with certainty. Instead, it framed a question he could no longer avoid, a question that would follow him long after the camp itself faded from view. As the days accumulated and the rhythms of the camp became familiar, the man's attention shifted from anticipation to observation. The absence of cruelty no longer felt temporary, yet it still resisted explanation. What emerged instead was a slow awareness of structure, an understanding that what governed this place was not indifference, nor spontaneous kindness, but discipline applied with restraint. The camp functioned not through intimidation but through consistency, and that consistency carried an authority that was difficult to challenge or dismiss. He began to notice how power operated without spectacle. Guards did not seek validation through fear. They did not linger to enjoy compliance, nor did they provoke it unnecessarily. When intervention was required, it was swift and proportionate, designed to restore order rather than assert dominance. This was unfamiliar terrain. He had been trained to associate authority with force, obedience with pressure. Here, authority existed without theatrics, and obedience followed without ritualized humiliation. This realization forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth. Brutality was not an inevitability of control. It was a choice. The restraint he witnessed daily was not the absence of power, but evidence of it being deliberately contained. The guards could have acted otherwise. They simply did not. That fact unsettled him more deeply than open aggression ever could, because it suggested a moral dimension to authority he had long denied. He found himself watching individual guards more closely, not in search of weakness, but in search of humanity. Small details emerged. Fatigue at the end of long shifts. Quiet conversations exchanged during moments of pause. The subtle way responsibility weighed on them, not as a burden resented, but as a duty carried carefully. They were not saints, nor were they indifferent functionaries. They were people operating within a framework that demanded restraint, and they appeared committed to that demand. This observation dismantled another assumption he had carried unquestioned, that systems absolved individuals of moral responsibility. Here, the system did not erase choice, it structured it. Rules existed not to license cruelty, but to prevent it. Discipline functioned as a guardrail rather than a weapon. In recognizing this, he began to see how easily responsibility could be redirected or obscured elsewhere, and how rare it was to encounter a system that insisted on accountability without spectacle. The camp, once perceived as a place of waiting, became a site of reflection. Not intentional reflection imposed from above, but unavoidable reflection arising from contradiction. He could no longer rely on the simple moral binaries that had once sustained him. Enemy and ally blurred. Victim and victor lost their clarity. The guards did not fit the role he had assigned them, and in failing to do so, they forced him to reconsider the role he had assigned himself. He began to understand that restraint, when consistently applied, carries its own moral weight. It communicates expectation without threat. It demands self-regulation rather than submission through fear. Living under such conditions required a different internal posture. Compliance born of terror could be passive. Compliance under restraint required engagement. It demanded that he acknowledge the rules not as arbitrary impositions, but as boundaries meant to be respected. This shift was not comfortable. It stripped him of the justifications he had prepared. If he was not being dehumanized, then he could no longer define himself solely as a victim of circumstance. If authority here was exercised responsibly, then comparisons to his own experiences became unavoidable. He began to recall moments where power had been wielded carelessly, where restraint had been abandoned in favor of expedience. These memories surfaced uninvited, reframed by the environment he now inhabited. He did not arrive at condemnation or absolution. Instead, he arrived at awareness. Awareness that moral failure was not always loud. That cruelty did not always announce itself as such. That systems could normalize excess as easily as they could normalize restraint. This awareness did not accuse him directly, but it unsettled the foundations of his understanding. The guard's restraint also altered the emotional atmosphere of the camp. Tension remained, but it was no longer defined solely by fear. It became a tension of uncertainty, of unarticulated questions. The prisoners were not broken down, but neither were they reassured. They existed in a space where behavior mattered, where choices had consequences that were predictable and limited. This predictability fostered a strange form of dignity, fragile but present. He noticed changes within himself. He stood differently. He listened more carefully. The constant vigilance that had once consumed him began to ease, replaced by a quieter alertness. He was still cautious, still aware of his position, but he was no longer bracing for sudden collapse. This shift freed mental space he had not realized was occupied, and into that space came reflection. Reflection led him to consider the nature of obedience. He had once believed obedience was enforced through fear, that it was a response to threat. Here, obedience emerged through structure and expectation. The rules were clear. The consequences were measured. There was no incentive to test boundaries through defiance, nor to submit through despair. This balance revealed obedience as something more complex than he had allowed himself to see. In this environment, he could no longer hide behind the idea that individuals were powerless within systems. He saw guards making choices daily, small, consistent choices to uphold restraint. That they did so without recognition or praise only reinforced the significance of those choices. It suggested an internalized ethic rather than external compulsion. This realization reframed his understanding of strength. Strength was not the capacity to inflict harm, but the capacity to refrain from it. Authority did not require excess to be effective. On the contrary, excess weakened legitimacy. These ideas, once abstract or dismissed, now carried the weight of lived experience. He also began to see how restraint functioned as a mirror. It reflected back the behavior of those subjected to it. Without provocation, prisoners had fewer excuses for misconduct. Without humiliation, defiance lost its justification. Behavior became a matter of personal responsibility rather than reaction. This shift quietly altered dynamics within the camp, reducing conflict not through fear, but through predictability. As weeks passed, the camp's moral texture grew clearer. It was not a place of absolution, but neither was it a place of vengeance. It existed in an uncomfortable middle ground that demanded recognition of complexity. Living within that complexity required endurance of a different kind, the endurance of ambiguity. For the man, this ambiguity became transformative. He no longer viewed himself solely as someone awaiting judgment. He began to see himself as someone being observed not for punishment, but for behavior. That distinction mattered. It implied that his actions still carried meaning, that he was not merely an object awaiting outcome. This recognition was both empowering and unsettling. Empowering because it restored a measure of agency. Unsettling because it removed the shelter of inevitability. If outcomes were not predetermined, then responsibility remained active. He could no longer tell himself that nothing he did mattered. By the end of this period, the camp had altered his internal landscape in ways he had not anticipated. The wire still enclosed him, the guards still enforced rules, and the future remained uncertain. Yet the moral environment had shifted irreversibly. He had witnessed authority exercised with restraint, power tempered by discipline, and control enacted without cruelty. These observations did not offer comfort. They offered clarity. And clarity, once gained, could not be unlearned. The camp had not delivered punishment, nor had it offered forgiveness. Instead, it had exposed him to a form of power that challenged everything he thought he understood about war, responsibility, and the choices people make when given control over others. The shift did not announce itself as transformation. There was no moment of relief, no sudden gratitude that swept through him and replaced the vigilance he had carried for so long. Instead, the change arrived as a slow reorientation, subtle and deeply uncomfortable. The longer he remained within the camp's restrained order, the harder it became to sustain the internal posture he had adopted at the moment of capture. What began as confusion matured into something more demanding: comparison. He started to measure what he was experiencing against what he remembered. Not just memories of battle, but of systems, hierarchies, and the ways authority had once been exercised around him. The contrast grew sharper with time. The kindness he encountered here was not sentimental or personal. It was procedural, embedded into routine. And because it was embedded, it could not be dismissed as anomaly. It functioned regardless of who stood on either side of the wire. This realization produced an unexpected form of shame. Not the shame of humiliation or exposure, but the quieter shame that arises when one recognizes a standard and understands, without being told, that it was not met elsewhere. No one accused him. No one reminded him of what he had done or represented. Yet the restraint he lived under acted as a constant reference point, silently asking how different choices might have altered outcomes long before this camp ever existed. He found himself recalling moments he had previously justified without hesitation. Orders followed because they were orders. Actions taken because refusal seemed unthinkable. In the context of war, necessity had been the ultimate defense. Yet here, necessity was being interpreted differently. Control existed without excess. Compliance was achieved without cruelty. These facts did not erase the pressures he had once faced, but they complicated the narrative that had absolved him of reflection. Gratitude emerged not as warmth, but as tension. He was grateful to be alive, to be unharmed, to be treated with restraint. But that gratitude carried weight. It demanded acknowledgement of contrast. Being spared did not feel like luck alone. It felt like an outcome shaped by choices others were making daily. Those choices, in turn, highlighted the reality that alternatives had always existed, even if they had seemed invisible at the time. This awareness did not lead him towards self-condemnation in dramatic terms. Instead, it produced a steady, inescapable unease. He could no longer take refuge in the belief that systems inevitably produced certain behaviors. The camp demonstrated that systems could be designed to limit harm rather than amplify it. That demonstration undermined the argument that brutality was simply the cost of order. He began to understand that punishment was not the only mechanism through which accountability could operate. Living under restraint, without being reduced or degraded, forced a different kind of reckoning. It required him to remain present, to think, to remember. Punishment might have allowed him to externalize guilt, to frame suffering as payment. Restraint denied him that transaction. It left the moral ledger unresolved. This unresolved state was exhausting. There was no catharsis, no moment of absolution. Instead, there was continuity. Each day reinforced the same conditions, the same expectations, the same refusal to confirm his worst assumptions. Over time, this continuity wore down his defenses more effectively than any act of violence could have. It did not break him, it exposed him. He noticed changes in how he related to others within the camp. Conversations grew less guarded, though still cautious. The shared experience of restraint created a fragile sense of dignity among the prisoners. They were not united by suffering imposed from above, but by the quiet burden of reflection. The absence of overt cruelty meant there was little to rally against, little to blame for their internal discomfort. This discomfort manifested differently in different individuals. Some grew resentful, interpreting restraint as condescension. Others retreated inward, unwilling to confront the implications. For him, the discomfort sharpened his awareness. He began to see how easily cruelty could be justified when framed as necessity, and how difficult it was to confront one's own capacity for harm when no one else was enforcing that confrontation. The kindness he experienced did not erase the past. It did not offer forgiveness or redemption. Instead, it illuminated the space between what had happened and what could have happened. That space was where shame settled, not as accusation, but as recognition. Recognition that choices mattered. That restraint was possible. That moral failure was not always the result of impossible circumstances, but often of unexamined assumptions. He realized that punishment might have been easier. It would have confirmed his expectations, validated his narrative of inevitability. Suffering would have felt earned, transactional. Restraint, by contrast, offered no such closure. It left him responsible for his own understanding. It demanded that he sit with ambiguity, with the knowledge that being spared did not equate to being absolved. This form of accountability was quieter, but it was also more persistent. It followed him through routine tasks, through moments of rest, through the long hours of waiting. It was present in the way guards enforced rules without humiliation, in the way care was administered without commentary. Each instance reinforced the same message without stating it outright: harm was not required to maintain order. As this message settled in, he began to feel a subtle shift in his sense of self. He was no longer defined solely by what had been done to him or by what he had done. He existed in a present shaped by choices made by others, choices that modeled an alternative to the patterns he had known. This modeling did not instruct him directly, but it influenced him nonetheless. He started to imagine what it would mean to carry this experience forward, not as a story of mercy received, but as evidence of possibility. The thought was unsettling. It implied responsibility beyond survival. It suggested that witnessing restraint carried an obligation to acknowledge it, to remember it, perhaps even to emulate it in some form. The camp did not encourage such reflection explicitly. There were no programs, no lectures, no moral instruction. The environment itself was the lesson, though it never claimed to be one. Its power lay in its refusal to dramatize. The absence of spectacle forced attention inward. By this stage, gratitude and shame were no longer separable. They existed together, intertwined. He was grateful not because he had been spared punishment, but because he had been confronted with a version of authority that challenged his assumptions. He felt shame not because he was accused, but because he recognized the distance between that authority and what he had once accepted as unavoidable. This recognition did not resolve itself neatly. It remained open, unfinished, but it altered his orientation toward the world. He could no longer view cruelty as an inevitable byproduct of power. He had seen evidence to the contrary, lived within it, been shaped by it. In this way, the camp achieved something punishment alone could not have. It forced a moral reckoning without imposing one. It left him changed not through suffering inflicted, but through restraint maintained. And in that quiet, persistent contrast, something within him shifted irreversibly, even as the wire still stood and the future remained uncertain. The end did not arrive as a moment of release, nor did it present itself with ceremony or resolution. There was no single day when the meaning of the wire dissolved completely, no dramatic crossing that could be marked in memory as the conclusion of one life and the beginning of another. Instead, the wire lost its power gradually, not because it was removed, but because its purpose had quietly changed. What once symbolized judgment now functioned merely as structure. It remained present, visible, unquestioned, yet it no longer defined the emotional or moral center of his existence. By this stage, he no longer waited for punishment. The expectation that had once shaped every thought had eroded under the weight of consistency. The camp had revealed itself not as a place of delayed retribution, but as a space where cycles were deliberately interrupted. That realization did not bring relief so much as clarity. He understood now that what had crossed the wire was not forgiveness, nor mercy in its sentimental form, but restraint enacted as principle.